All right, we're ready for Colossians chapter 4. This will wind up our study in Colossians. Next week will be Philemon, and we'll finish up this trimester. So, let's review where we've been in the book of Colossians, chapter 1 of Colossians. All right, the preeminence of Christ. Verse 18 would be the key verse for the chapter, that he is preeminent in all things. Chapter 2. All right, we are complete in him. Very good. Key verse is verse 10 of chapter 2. All right, now chapter 3, what's it about? Life hidden with Christ. Key verse would be verse 3. Very good. Verse 3. So we're ready for chapter 4. Let's go to question number 8. How would you summarize this chapter, and what's the main point? Say again. All right, pray and redeem the time. All right, good. Anything else? All right, more about that here in a second. Here's our outline of the book that we are following. And we have chapter 4 divided into 2 of the 5 sections. After the introduction, we have the preeminent Christ. We're complete in him. We have chapter 3 into chapter 4, verse 6, as per this outline, the life hidden with Christ. And then here's the greetings and salutations, verses 7 to 18. We'll outline that just a little differently in just a moment for our purposes today. In fact, I call chapter 4 Responsibilities of the New Man. You remember in chapter 3, he talked about putting off the old man and putting on the new man. And then here were various responsibilities of the new man that we talked about. What were some of those? What were some of the characteristics? All right, meekness, kindness, verse 12. Here's some of the characteristics. Long-suffering. So he has personal godliness. We talked in verse 16 that he worships God. We mentioned at verse 17 he respects authority. Verses 18 and following, he fulfills what? Family obligations. And then beginning at verse 22, what else does he do? Yes, here's an address to servants and how they are to be obedient servants. And so our application obviously would be, as we are employed to work for others, we are to be diligent, hard workers. And so this section of Colossians 3 at the end talks about responsibilities of the new man. If you're a servant, you are to be the best servant you can be. Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord. So starting in chapter 4, he goes through more responsibilities of this new man. This is one of those perhaps unfortunate chapter divisions that it might have been better had verse 6 been the end of chapter 3. Chapter divisions were put by man, so that's not a reflection on anything divine, and that would fit right with that whole section we just looked at. But this is more responsibilities of the new man in verses 1 to 6. Then there's salutations, and then there's the conclusion to the letter. And there's something to be learned from every one of those sections. Let's talk about more responsibilities of the new man. So let's start with this master's responsibility. We just talked about the responsibility of the servant. This one is about the master. Let's go to our questions again. Let's go to question number 1. How does the instructions of masters and servant apply to us today? All right, the mutual respect of employers and employees, that's good. What else? Okay.
No matter who you are, somebody's in charge of you. So every one of us is going to have someone that controls us somehow.
Yes, and ultimately, if we are the king of the earth, we still have God over us. We're always submissive to another master. Fair treatment, would you agree with that? fair pay. Would that be part of what's taught here? And then the reason is given. Let's look at the screen. There's master's responsibility. I've divided that into what we do and why we do it. First of all, let's read verse 1. Masters, give your servants what is just and fair. Give your servants what is just and fair. Now, what would that include? Both wages and treatment. So you pay them fairly. Don't expect someone to do a job that ought to be paid $100 for that job and expect to pay them $5 for it because you can get away with that. Give them fair wages. Treat them fairly. Does that make sense? So if you're the master, if you're the employer, and whether you're employing someone to work in your yard or you're employing someone in your business, make sure that you pay fair wages, but also humane treatment. That's just and fair, is it not? And so it's just as much a responsibility on the part of the master as it is on the part of the servant. Now, can you imagine if the servant is a Christian and the master is a Christian, how they're going to treat one another? I want to pay you fairly. I want to work just as hard as I can for you. What a great relationship that would be. Now, at the last part of verse 4, here's the reason for that. Why? What's the reason you want to pay them fairly and treat them fairly? All right, what does that have to do? You're right, but what does that have to do with anything? All right, he treats us all fairly. What else? We ultimately work for the Lord. Something else I'm fishing for. Bingo. Yeah, we're going to have to answer to that master. We've got a master to answer to, so I want to make sure I'm treating others right. He treats me fairly, and I have to give an answer to him whether I've treated others fairly, so therefore we want to treat others properly and right. Just because you can get away with something as a servant or as a master doesn't make it right, does it? I get away with it, nobody's going to know, they don't know any different. That's not the point. Now let's talk about prayer, verses 2 to 4, and let's go work our way through the things concerning prayer. Let's go to a question now. Question number 2. List the points you learn about prayer from verses 2 to 4. What'd you learn? Pray steadfast. What else? Say again. Be thankful. Vigilant. Or vigilant. I'm trying to say diligence and vigilant at the same time. That doesn't work. Go again. Was that you? Who was it? Grateful. All right. Pray for opportunities. Pray for others. All right, pray for those who preach the word. All right, let's work through the list here. First of all, at verse 2, let's just work through our list here. Continue earnestly in prayer. The idea of earnestly, same word is found in another place, continued steadfastly. One lexicographer or commentator said, the verb means holding to something with strength, hence not neglecting or letting it drop. In other words, don't neglect your responsibility with reference to prayer. Give attention to prayer without neglecting it. Is it easy to neglect prayer? Why would that be easy?
Sometimes we get mixed up in our word and prayer. We kind of put God aside in prayer.
All right. All right, bingo. That my attendance is something everybody takes notice of whether I'm attending. I wasn't here for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and somebody's going to take notice of that. But you may not notice that I haven't been praying as much as I should, or not as diligent as I should. So the responsibility lies on our shoulders to look at ourselves and am I praying diligently? So continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant. What does that suggest to you? I'm sorry? On purpose. It literally means to keep awake or to watch, to keep alert, to be alert or attentive while you pray. Perhaps it has the idea of being vigilant while you're praying and watch and not just go through a ritual. Is it easy to go through a ritual of words? These are the words that we always say at this point. This is what I always say before I go to bed at night. This is what I always say when I get up in the morning and go through the ritual of words. Be vigilant, watchful, careful in the wording of your prayer. All right? Then the next thing he mentions is with thanksgiving, which suggests the idea of being, as part of being vigilant, that we ought to be thankful to God. We won't spend much time on that. Not that it's unimportant, we just know what it means. Now, in verse 3, his point is, you pray for us, and there are two things that he suggests they pray for. What are they? What does that mean? Opportunities. Pray for opportunities that an open door. It's interesting here. Paul, where is Paul at the time of this letter? He's in prison. And when he says pray for us, he doesn't tell them pray for my release, but pray for the door of opportunity. Be it the door of opportunity while I'm in prison. We know from Philippians that door had been opened. May it be more open because I am in prison, or it may be that if I may be released, that I might have an open door to go preach. But not that I may get out because I don't want to be in prison. He never mentions that. That's interesting. And then he prays for another aspect. Pray for us for what? To speak the mystery of Christ. Say again, Andrew. Very good. Yes, speak as I ought to speak. Let's look at the parallel. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 20. Remember, Colossians and Ephesians are parallel. You can trace many of the same thoughts from one book to the other. They're thought to be written at the same time. Ephesians 6:20, he speaks that I'm an ambassador in chains, that it may be that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. In other words, I think his request is pray for us, for open doors, and that we may have boldness to speak when we need to speak, that we may speak truth to power. He's going to have an opportunity to speak before men of great power who could take his head off, and may we have the wisdom and the courage to speak that truth to power. Any questions or comments on verses 2 to 4 on praying? Right.
He still continued preaching, and to the point that later on we can read of being saints in Caesar's household. So it was effective.
He had an opportunity to preach when he didn't have otherwise because he was in prison. And I think thankful for that opportunity seems to be. Pray for us. Absolutely.
Well, I'm in this situation, so I can't do that. But sometimes that's where it's needed most.
Good point. It very well may be when we think the door's been closed, the door's just been opened. Where you think, well, I'm in prison, the door's closed, I can't do much. But the door was open while he was in prison to some people that he wouldn't have the door open to at all. Good point, very good point. Yes, ma'am.
When it says being watchful in it, can that also carry with the idea of being on the lookout for opportunities of things that need to be prayed for?
Yes. And Jesus made a statement, being watchful in prayer. And I think that's part of it, is that you're watchful for things that I need to be praying for my own good, for temptations or whatever it may be in my own life. Yeah, I think that would be included. Good point. All right, let's move on. More responsibilities. Master's responsibilities, pray. Now at verse 5, walk in wisdom toward those that are outside. Let's get the verse and then let's see what it means. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, and then we'll come back a little bit later, redeeming the time. Let's go to question number 3. What does walk in wisdom toward those who are outside mean?
We should view the way that they live when they're outside, we're not Christians.
All right, that's good. What else?
Let others see by your actions that you are a Christian. Otherwise, by the example you're setting, it is the best way for kids to learn. If they see you doing something, whether keep
Good point. Good point. Let's talk about wisdom. What is wisdom? You think this is talking about knowledge at this point, or is this talking about something else? Proper use of that knowledge, all right? That's another word for wisdom here. We should use good judgment in dealing with those who are outside. Outside would have reference to non-Christians. As we deal with, in the whole spectrum, by the way, of this whole section, perhaps even verse 1, all has to do with increasing our influence with the gospel. If you look at every one of these responsibilities, and that may be why the translators set these off to themselves in this chapter rather than shoving it in the other chapter. I don't know. I'm just saying maybe. Because every one of these seem to relate somehow to my influence, your influence, as we try to further the gospel. So you be the good master and you may have an influence with the gospel. You pray for the furtherance of the gospel. Furthermore, you walk in wisdom toward those who are outside. That is, use some judgment as you deal with people. In other words, we need to stop and think how our words and actions will be taken. Not just whether the words are true. We need to think about the impression that we're leaving. We may leave the wrong impression. Here are a couple of translations. The New American Standard said, conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders. The New International says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Can you think of a way that sometimes when I say we, I'm using that in a broad sense, that Christians may try to influence those non-Christians, but they use a lack of wisdom and judgment and do more damage than good? How could that happen?
Sometimes we separate ourselves from the world to such an extent that we don't have any influence on the world.
Okay.
And then sometimes we are speaking the truth without love. We might have the truth, but we're lacking in the love for the other person and what we're talking to them about.
Case in point, the good point. I've told this story before, but I was in a meeting in Arkansas several years ago, and we had some non-Christians visiting one night. We were glad they were there. And there was another visitor who was a preacher, but he was kind of a fireball. And he cornered the visitors, and I mean, chewed on them good. Asked them where they were from, and they said, well, we're from I forgot what denomination, say Baptist Church. And I mean, he started preaching to them, where in the world do you find the Baptist Church? Do you know you're going to go to hell if you stay in the Baptist Church? And I mean, he just started preaching to them. Well, they never came back, and they kind of abruptly left. Now, was he right in what he said? Yeah. Those who overheard his conversation did not disagree with the points he made. How he worded it and the tack did more damage than good. Timing has a whole lot to do with that. Make sense? Use wisdom toward those who are outside in what we say. Not only in our words, but maybe my actions. I don't want to leave the wrong impression, even though I'm doing something right. I want to make sure they understand what we're doing and why. Make sense? Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside. So use wisdom and judgment, be concerned about our impression. Same verse, redeeming the time. What does that mean? All right, the best use of your time? Say again. Take advantage of the opportunity, yes. Make wise use. Use the opportunity we have. The New American Standard renders that making the most of the opportunity. Again, this is in the context of the spread of the gospel. I think it's a general principle that applies to a number of areas, but the whole thrust seems to be our influence in the gospel. Does that make sense? Seize the opportunity. The opportunity may be there and we just didn't seize it. So use every opportunity. Make wise use of your time. And we can... That's a good point. And as Annie Lou mentioned a moment ago about Paul being in prison, we may think that door's closed. Man, I can't do anything. And yet here's the open door that I get to speak to people who wouldn't listen otherwise. So maybe when the door just slammed in your face, you look around and another door behind you is open and just go through it and use that opportunity. All right, let's go to verse 6 now. And he talks about proper speech. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how to answer each one. Now, there's several things involved in that. 3 things were listed here. Let's take them one at a time. This has to do with our proper speech toward those that are outside. How do you address and how do you speak to, how do you communicate with those who are outside? Let your speech be always with grace. Let's go to question 5 first, and that is, what is speech that is with grace seasoned with salt?
Be careful of the word we use, and approach the others like he's talking about the devil also. You don't go in there and just be harsh. Go in there with calmness and work around it, just have a conversation together.
All right. That's good.
I go back to that preacher who was talking about the way he addressed those from the Baptist church.
Yeah.
Be tactful. Think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. Think before you say it.
All right. Good.
Think of food that's seasoned properly, you want some more of it.
All right. There's another word for that. It's palatable. What does that mean? What Stephen just talked about. Pleasing to the taste. And so if it's something I need and it's pleasing to the taste, it's easier to take in, isn't it? And maybe here's something good for you, but if it isn't seasoned properly, it's kind of hard to take in. So make sure your speech is seasoned properly so that people take it in, because that's what you want them. You want them to take in your speech, right?
You want more of it.
Want more? Exactly. All right, we'll come back to question 6 here in a second. Let's talk about always with grace. The Revised Standard Version says that our manner of speech should be gracious. Gracious in our manner of speech. Walton Weaver's comment on this passage says there will be words that are not abusive or vindictive, but speech that is loving and caring. In other words, you can talk to somebody about their soul being lost and they're in danger and they're in sin, and say it in a way that I care about you and I don't want to see you go that direction. Or you could say the same thing. It's like you're on the road to hell and I know you are, and I'm kind of glad I got to be the one to tell you that. And one will be effective and the other one will not. Make sense? Yes, ma'am.
I think about the way Christ talked to people that didn't know. He was compassionate and he was kind to people that just didn't know.
Yeah.
He saved his harsh words for people that knew better.
Yeah.
And acted out of pride and hypocrisy.
Good point. Like the Pharisees, he rebuked them very severely, but otherwise he was very gracious. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just gonna say, we use often the analogy of feeding with the gospel. And as we were talking about, the picture came to mind of, when you start feeding a child, you go very slowly. You don't shove the spoon in their mouth. You don't try to force. You try to entice, and you go in small increments. And it's that, I think it's that idea of when you've got someone who is outside and doesn't know the word, to treat them as if they're a small child that you're feeding in small increments and slowly, and checking to see that they're not choking and being concerned.
It's a good point, because sometimes they can choke on that. We've given them far too much, and we've overcrowded them. Yes.
Verse finances, our actions go hand in hand with our speech. So we can talk the talk all day long, as bland or as enthusiastic, as salty as possible. But if we're not living that example, we're not going to have any effect.
Good point. Good point. That makes it effective. I want us to look at this last phrase, know how to answer, the New King James words that each one, one translation will say how to respond to each person. There's 2 thoughts perhaps in mind. One is the idea that you ought to know how to answer everybody. But I think it's really more the idea, and I won't give the quotation fully, but Walton Weaver explores the 2 different original words that would have been used. And I would just have you to consult him on that. But here's the point, that it's the idea of literally each separate person. And you deal with each person based on their individuality and their circumstance. And there may be that I need to be a little harsher dealing with this one than I do that one. And I may need to take a little more time with this one than I do that one. That makes sense? That I need to have wisdom, and so that my proper speech is not only with grace seasoned with salt, but I gear my language and my approach and my answer based on that person. If they're real strong in their argument against the truth, I might be stronger in my response back. But if they're merely raising a question, I don't clobber them all of a sudden because he just raised a question. I want to answer the question delicately and simply. Does that make sense? That you may know how to answer each individual person. You don't answer them all the same. You give them the same Bible answer, but you may push back a little harder with this one than you do that one. You may give just a little bit of information here because that's all they can handle, and you may give a lot of information there. Dennis?
I think too, sometimes you have to get on their level. So
Yes.
you can understand what they're telling you.
Yes.
Because if you're up high and they're down here, they're not going to get it.
Yeah. There are times that you flood somebody with information because they can handle that. You know, I know them, and I can flood them with a bunch of information and cite various sources, and there it is. But somebody else, I may just take one verse and talk very slowly and very simply because that's all they can take at this point. I got to be very simplistic. So you know how to answer each one. Yes, ma'am.
I think too, it's worth noting that we shouldn't expect non-Christians to behave like Christians. A lot of people just have really no understanding at all
Yeah.
of where we're coming from.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we just go to ground zero.
Yeah. They just haven't been taught. And don't expect them to know what we know. And that's a good point. All right, again, I want to make this point, then we'll move off of it. All five of those areas, I think, seemingly relate to this idea of our influence with the gospel. Be the right kind of master, be the right kind of servant, back in the previous chapter. Pray, walk in wisdom, redeem the time, proper speech, etc. Let's talk about salutations. Let's see, we can go through this a little quicker. It's not that it's unimportant. In fact, it is very important. But let's talk about the salutation. There are three classes dealt with here. First of all, there are those that Paul sends to Colossae. And so here's mentioned two. So let's talk about each one of those. At verse 7, there's Tychicus. He's mentioned in 5 passages in the New Testament. He was with Paul on his third journey, Acts 20. He was with Paul during the first imprisonment and during the second imprisonment. So he was close to Paul. He's going to send him. Why is he sending him? There's one or two purposes. Yes. He is sending so he can inform them about what's going on with Paul. Some translations, and this is a textual issue, is whether majority minority text. And so depending on which you favor, one would suggest that not only the minority text favors the idea that I'm sending him to tell of our affairs, and then also he will find out and get the information about how things are going with you. The other text, I'm just looking for sending him to tell of our affairs. It's a textual issue. We won't go into that. I'm not prepared. But I generally favor the minority text. But anyway, then there's another man he's sending, Onesimus. What do we know about Onesimus? All right, he's a servant. Where else do we read about him? Philemon. This is Philemon's runaway slave. And he calls him a brother here. It's interesting, and his home, by the way, was in Colossae, so he's sending him back. And Philemon will give us more information about that. But he doesn't refer to him as a runaway slave. He calls him a brother. That's interesting, isn't it? And I'm sending him along with Tychicus. Then here are those who send greetings, verses 10 to 14. Now, there are 6 that are listed here. The first 3 are identified as being of the circumcision. That makes us conclude the rest must be of the Gentiles. And there's Aristarchus, verse 10. My fellow prisoner greets you. He's mentioned in 5 different verses. We don't know a lot about him, except he's mentioned several times, like in Acts 19, Acts 20, and Acts 27, Colossians 4 here, and Philemon 24. Now, who is this Mark? John Mark. He's the cousin of Barnabas. There was a man that went on the first missionary journey and turned back. Paul had lost confidence in him for a while. But by this point, he seems to have regained some confidence in him. There's a practical lesson to learn in that. There may be people who disappoint us, but we don't need to hold that against them forever if they make a change and they grow and they mature. Somebody may show great immaturity in whatever they've done. And yet if they show maturity, they've grown and developed, then give them credit for that. He did with John Mark. The next man that's listed is Jesus. That was a common name. We think Jesus only refers to Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. But this was one who was called Justus. We know very little about him, but he had brought comfort to Paul. That's all we know. And he's sending greetings to y'all. The next three would be Gentiles. And so there is Epaphras. And what do we know about him? We talked about him at the beginning of the book. Mentioned in chapter 1 and in verse 7. As you learned from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful member in Christ on your behalf. What I'm about to say is, do I know it to be true 100%? No, but it is conjectured by many that he probably established the church at Colossae. We have no record of Paul going there. He may have, but we don't have a record of that. Some think that Epaphras started the work there, and they think Colossians 1:7 is pointing to that. I'll leave that for you to judge for yourself. But he very well may have started. But what does he say about Epaphras? 2 verses are devoted to him in this short book, short chapter. All right, very good. Now notice those phrases he went through. He's a servant of God. He greets you. He's one of you. So he's been a part of this work. And he's now with Paul at this moment. But always laboring fervently in prayers. In other words, he's praying earnestly. I've taken note of this, Paul said. He prays and he prays and he prays earnestly for you. Now what was the goal of his prayer? That you may stand firm or stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. What does that mean? Just a minute, Mark. I want the English Standard on that verse 12. What does that mean? Mature? In all the will of God. What would that suggest?
I think that they would be a strong, sound church.
Yeah, be strong and stand strong in all areas. Sometimes we stand strong on morals, but we may be weak on Bible authority. Or we may stand strong against innovations, but we're weak on morals. I want you to be mature in all areas. English Standard, Mark. Mature and fully assured. That's the idea, being fully mature in the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you and for those of Laodicea and Hierapolis. That was part of the triune group of churches. I don't mean they were united in any organizational way, but in this Lycus Valley right here, Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae was right in a little triangle. Those three churches are mentioned right there. Now let's move on. The next one that's mentioned is Luke. What do we know about Luke that's mentioned here? He's a physician. The only passage that mentions him as being a physician. We have insight to that in the gospel and in the book of Acts because he uses some medical terms. But I think this is the only reference that ever calls him a physician. Now, then the last one that's mentioned is Demas. What do we know about Demas? Very good, yes. 2 Timothy 4:10. That was during the second imprisonment. This is first imprisonment. So at this point, he has great confidence in Demas. But later he says, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved the present world. Seem to be the same Demas. So there are people who he had no confidence in earlier, and he's regained it. And here's somebody he's got confidence in now, and he later on doesn't have much confidence. That'll happen to any one of us. There's people you have confidence in now, 5 years from now you won't have any confidence. And there's somebody you have no confidence in at all. you're going to have confidence in him in the future. That happens. That's just the nature of how the gospel works. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea and Nymphas and the church that is in his house. Again, a textual issue as to whether Nymphas is male or female. Your translation may say Nympha, and it may say her house. It probably refers to one of two things. Either the church met in their household or has reference to those in their household that were Christians. I'm not sure which. Now, and that's in verse 15 now, those that Paul sends greetings to. And that's what we just saw at verse 15. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea and Nymphas or Nympha, whichever translation you choose. So here's the salutations. Now let's move on and get the conclusion. And we've got time for this. And here is something we need to pay attention to at verse 16. There's to be an exchange of letter. Read this epistle among you and then see that it's also read in the church of Laodicea. And make sure you read the letter from the epistle from Laodicea. There's a couple of things I want to mention here if we don't get any further. What is that letter from the church at Laodicea? It's either a letter that was not intended to be canonized, probably so. Some think that that's the book of Ephesians. And even though Ephesians mentions it's written to the church at Ephesus, there is some textual issue about whether or not the term Ephesus is found in Ephesians 1:1. And so some think that's the letter that he's talking about because it seems to be parallel. And so it doesn't matter to me. I don't care. That's just a little tidbit of trivia there for what it's worth. But here's the point. This letter was written to Colossae, but it was intended to be benefiting to the church at Laodicea. And whatever letter that Laodicea got, whether a letter that we don't have or the book of Ephesians, you need to read it, and it applies to you too. So I'm learning a lesson about canonization. What do I mean by that? That's true, but that's not where I was going, but you're right about that. Not everything that was written, even inspired, is canonized. That's one thing. I think that's what you were saying. No, that was fine. But I'm learning something about how canonization came about. Does that make sense?
I think, just like John the Baptist was said, sit as a forerunner of Christ, this might be the kind of application of us receiving the scriptures today by reading, because we have a qualification or a group of books today that we read that are sent to different people for our learning.
Yes. But here's the letter that was sent to Colossae, and scribes would make copies. Make sure this gets over to the church at Laodicea. Now, they have a copy of a letter they know is inspired of Paul. Well, that's how that's the process of canonization. So here are recognized scriptures that this is inspired. We've got this letter from Colossae. We've got a copy of it. We got that letter, let's say it is the book of Ephesians, that we got from the church over at Laodicea. We know it's inspired. There's evidence. And so we put that together, and that's the process of canonization. Now, there's more to it than that. That's the Cliff Notes version of it. So as you study canonization, you do a thorough study of it, you're going to come across Colossians 4 in that reference. You're going to grapple with Colossians 4 somewhere in studying about canonization. What was the message to Archippus? Yes. Take heed to the ministry and fulfill that ministry. Would that apply to any of us? Yeah, whatever responsibility is laid upon you, you fulfill that responsibility. And then notice how he ends the book. The salutation in my own hand. Paul did not always write. Many times he worked by penman, evidence in the book of Romans chapter 16. And then he would sign off in his own hand as a signature that this is authentic. And so he signs off in his own hand, and then he said, remember my chains. Yeah, my imprisonment. And again, he doesn't say anything about pray that I be released, but just pray for the circumstance that I'm in. Make sense? All right. That's the book of Colossians.